Alright, I want to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, or Game of Thrones, or the world of Ice and Fire, that general world and universe, and the stories in it, and the author, and all that stuff. And mostly I want to talk about the recent interview George R.R. Martin gave in preparation for A Knights of the Seven Kingdoms airing. But first of all, I want to give you a very quick background about my experience with Game of Thrones, and my opinion towards, the current state of the series and that entire situation. And it might be a little bit different to the kind of opinions you're used to hearing about that matter. So first of all, I read A Song of Ice and Fire, all 5 books, about a decade ago now when I was at uni, and I adored it. I fell completely in love with the series, as many people did. It was kind of my gateway drug into fantasy proper, like it was for many people. Although this wasn't a huge surprise, I was already into fantasy before that, but not in any major way like I am nowadays. And my read through of the series very much got wrapped up in my watch through of the show at the same time, so there's definitely a lot of cross-pollination between the show and the books in my mind, and I do need to go through and read the books separately, completely by themselves at some point. I am holding off until Winds comes out, if it ever does. But here's the thing, right? Everyone's super frustrated about Winds of Winter, and here's the thing I want to stress, understandably so. There has been a 14-year gap between this book and the previous one after all. And so you get a lot of people being like, oh, don't get into Game of Thrones, it's not worth it. You know, the show ended terribly and the books are never going to be finished, whatever. What I would say is, if you are interested in A Song of Ice and Fire, read the books. Just go in knowing that they might never be finished, but you're still gonna have a fantastic time, in my opinion, reading those first 5 books. I still think they are worthwhile to read, knowing that the series is not finished and might never be finished. I think about the idea of leaving the series unfinished, because this was something that was on my mind reading it a decade ago, because I had heard about the big spaces of time between books and all this, right? I did sit and think, do I want to get into an unfinished series? And I just told myself, for once we're not going to worry about it. And I'm so glad that I did that, because if I sat there and I decided not to read it, I would be missing one of my favorite stories and worlds from my life. And my, I guess, controversial take, although I really don't think it should be, is that we should be, while I understand the frustration that's being leveled towards George R.R. Martin, and I'm not going to direct ire towards most people who are frustrated about it, I do think we should be showing George R.R. Martin our support, People will argue that he has not earned it, or that, the fact that he's taken so long to write these books, and might never finish the series, means that he should be, criticized and all this stuff, and to an extent that's true. But as somebody who is a writer but struggles so much with what is probably ADHD that I've never been able to finish a book, I understand how frustrating it is to want to finish a project, but for the chemicals in your mind which keep you interested and motivated to finish the project to just not be there one day when you wake up. And you can talk about discipline and how a writer should be able to force themselves to continue writing in those moments when inspiration flees. That is true to an extent, but when it comes to something like ADHD, and we don't know that George R.R. Martin has ADHD, but if that is what's going on with him, then you've got to understand it's more frustrating for the writer than it is for anybody else. And I come up against this on some of my YouTube projects as well. I did a video of me playing Lord of the Rings Online on my main channel, and that's done comparatively very well for me. And I've had people messaging me asking me when I'm going to continue that series, but my attention span has moved on to other things, and I just cannot find that game interesting anymore, and therefore I can't make myself make that video. It wouldn't be a good video if I did, and that's frustrating for me more than it is for anyone else, because it would help my channel be successful. I'm applying the same kind of thinking to George R.R. Martin, right? And I don't know him personally, that might be wrong. Maybe he's sitting there taking baths in bathtubs of money and cackling to himself and wiggling his fingers in glee and telling himself, I'm never going to finish the books, I already got everything I needed out of you suckers. I do not think that's the case though. Some people do. Some people accost him at Q&As and ask him who he's gonna get to take over because he's gonna die soon. We've seen that cringeworthy clip, right? That is the extreme level of frustration that I would say is not justified. But anyway, I said I was going to talk about this interview, and in this interview, George R. R. Martin did say some things which, as someone who supports him and wants the best for him and does not feel necessarily entitled to the last two books but still really wants them, I started to lose faith a bit after I saw this interview. And I know George R. R. Martin is never going to see this video, but on the off chance he does, again, I support the guy. I want him to do what he wants to do. I'm not one of those people who gets frustrated every time he talks about something that isn't writing Winds of Winter. If he wants to go and edit a bunch of wildcards, I'm in full support of that. He's an artist, and it is his right as a human being with free will to pursue his passions. And I fully intend on exploring his other works someday as well, and I'm excited that he's still doing things like wildcards and all these things, which I've yet to explore because they could be my next favourite thing. And indeed, one of my favourite Game of Thrones projects is the Fire and Blood book he did, the in-universe history book of the Targaryen kings. It is a part 1 out of 2, and who knows if we'll ever get part 2, but it's exquisite. It's so good, and it's because I'm a lore hound for this series, right? I love the lore of A Song of Ice and Fire so much, and this book is so good. And he talked about how he was I swear he's talked about this before, I don't have a source, so apologies if I'm wrong, but he's talked before about how he was encouraged to step away from Winds of Winter to go and write that, so that they would have more source material to build Game of Thrones show spin-offs from. But here's the thing, in this interview he talked about how he's currently focusing on writing more Duncan Egg novellas because of the show which has started up, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is based around that series. And that is what I take issue with. If it's his passion to go and write more Duncan Egg novellas, I fully support that. I've only read The Hedge Knight so far, and I really enjoyed it. I fully support him writing what he wants to write, especially if it's in the Thrones universe, because I know I'm probably going to like that. But the idea that he is writing it because he is worried about A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms turning out like the end of a Game of Thrones show, that is something I find problematic, because that sounds more like he is concentrating on HBO projects out of a sense of duty instead of following his passions. And to be fair, in this interview, he also talked about struggling with the Winds of Winter and motivation to continue writing the Winds of Winter, thereby suggesting that it is not his current passion to continue the Winds of Winter, and by my own logic that I've already laid out in this video, I should be fine with that. I'm fine with that. To an extent, I still want the Winds of Winter, obviously. And I've heard other writers talk about how sometimes they need to leave a project for a while and go and pursue other passions which are calling to them, and then they can return to a project with fresh eyes, and that helps them finish the initial project. That might be true of George R. R. Martin as well, it just might be a large time frame. But the idea of doing it because you're worried about the health of a spin-off show which you are not necessarily directly responsible for, that bothers me. Another thing which made me waver in this interview for the first time as a George R. R. Martin apologist, I guess, if we're going to be rude about it, is that when he was talking about the Winds of Winter and his difficulties with it, he started talking about things like how he would get very excited writing a Tyrion chapter, but then after finishing the chapter, he would realize it doesn't fit into the overall narrative, and he would have to change the entire story to suit that, and so he has to scrap the entire chapter and start over. Or more concerningly, he's made offhand comments about, yeah, I was considering killing Sansa, but she's really popular in the show, so I decided not to. Now, to be fair, that could be him being cheeky. I saw these comments in a second-hand nature of someone else talking about them. I haven't seen the interview itself, which is probably not very professional of me. So maybe he's joking, but if he's being serious, I take issue with that. That strikes me as he really doesn't know where he's going with this. However, discovery writing is a type of writing which is valid and has led to some of our favourite series ever being written, and perhaps George R. R. Martin is a discovery writer, by which I mean he kind of makes it up as he goes along with a loose plot in his head, and it works out. That would certainly explain the sudden intense focus on the Greyjoys from A Feast for Crows onwards, which I was not a huge fan of in my initial read through, but my mind could be changed if I read through it again. But yeah, for the first time, that has me a little bit concerned that maybe George wouldn't be the best person to finish the series. This is me speaking critically, not like personally. Like, I still support him, I still want him to finish the series, I want him to be the best person to finish the series. But my selfish desire, and I'm going to call this a selfish desire because this is me wanting an end product out of George, right? I do wish he would be more open to accepting help. He has talked many times about how he is the only person who is going to write this series, and even if the worst should happen and he passes away, he doesn't want anyone else finishing the series posthumously. And I've talked at length in this video about, you know, free will and, you know, the rights of an individual and their project being their baby and all that stuff. But this is when I would start to point to, but you have started a series that is extremely popular and there's a level of, you know, maybe expectation, maybe like responsibility that comes with that. I would implore you to please consider enlisting some help if you need it. But I'm going to label that a selfish desire of me wanting an end product, and if he's super uncomfortable with that, I'm just going to have to live with that as a fan. This is the way I wish people would talk about George R.R. Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire and A Game of Thrones. I understand the frustration and the cynicism, but I've seen people say, like, you know, he doesn't care, and he only talks about Game of Thrones and gets headlines talking about it because he's trying to milk the franchise to get more money. I think that requires a level of cynicism that I am never going to be able to achieve. I think it's very clear when you see George R.R. Martin talk about this series that he is very passionate about it and he cares about it, and he is very frustrated at his own current inability to finish the series. And again, I think the current attitude towards him from the majority of voices online is not helping. I think, you know, you can argue about whether he deserves support or not, but if you want this series to be finished, I think it would be a good idea to lend him your support and your positivity. When was the last time you saw people cheering for George R.R. Martin or talking about the series in a positive way in regards to how good the writing is or was and how excited you are for Winds of Winter? The entire discussion has been overtaken with frustration and bitterness and disappointment, and you've got to imagine how that would reflect on the writer of the series himself and his motivation to continue the series and finish it. So yeah, I think that about sums up my current feelings towards the series. And I'm not going to reiterate things I've said because I will just be regurgitating the same points over and over again at this point. I hope that what I said sounds sane and reasonable, but I know there will be some people who are furious at me for speaking positively about George R.R. Martin or A Game of Thrones at this point. But hey, I think fantasy is a big, big genre, and there are a ton of other fantastic series you can go and read while you are waiting for the end of this series, should it come or not. I follow booktubers who talk about science fiction and fantasy primarily, and they hardly ever mention A Game of Thrones anymore or A Song of Ice and Fire, which I find a little strange considering how good it is and how it's still relatively recent in comparison to the age of the entire genre. But yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff out there that I could recommend you, and A Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, it's not the end all be all. I say that as someone who adores the series. I really enjoy House of the Dragon, especially season 1. Season 2 was great too, but obviously it had some flaws. And I'm a little concerned about the future of that series given how long it's taking to make and budgetary concerns and all that stuff, but hopefully it turns out well. And yeah, I'll give A Knight of Seven Kingdoms a look. Probably when it finishes, I'll go and binge all of it, and then make a video about it. I'm probably not going to watch it week to week though. But I've heard good things from people who have seen it early. Apparently it's good. Apparently it's a little bit more comedic than we're used to, which would make sense given, you know, I've read The Hedge Knight, and it does definitely have a lighter tone to it despite still very much taking place within Westeros. But yeah, thanks for checking out this video. Let me know what you think down below, and leave a like if you liked the video. I will catch you in whatever I make next.